What if I told you that 7 aircraft flew for 30 hours straight, deep into one of the most heavily defended airspaces on the planet, dropped 14 bombs weighing 15 tons each, and not a single shot was fired at them the entire time? Not going in, not coming out. That actually happened. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly how. And you are going to understand why the story the world was told in the first 48 hours is not the same story that is true today, a year later. Stick with me, because the ending of this one is genuinely more interesting than the beginning. What's up, everybody? Ryan here, Max Afterburner, former F-15E Strike Eagle combat pilot, former F-16 Thunderbird pilot, and these days you'll find me flying commercial jets when I'm not sitting in front of this camera breaking down the most important military operations happening around the world. And today we are going deep, and I mean deep, into Operation Midnight Hammer, the American strike on Iran's nuclear program, and the bomb that made the entire thing possible, the GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrator. Before we get into it, I want to be straight with you about something. This is not a highlight reel. This is not fighter jets doing cool things set to music. This is a strike on nuclear infrastructure with real geopolitical weight, real consequences, and real unresolved questions that are still being argued about right now, more than a year after it happened. So my job here is simple. I'm going to walk you through what we actually know, pulled from Pentagon briefings, satellite imagery from independent nuclear watchdog groups, and reporting that has been tracking this story since day one. And where there is genuine dispute, and there is a lot of it, I'm going to tell you exactly where that dispute lives, instead of pretending this is more settled than it actually is. Most channels covered this in the first week and never touched it again. We are not doing that today. Let's get into it. To understand the American mission, you have to understand what came before it, because Midnight Hammer did not happen in a vacuum. Just hours before the first strikes of this entire conflict, the International Atomic Energy Agency had already concluded that Iran was in breach of its non-proliferation obligations. That finding mattered. It gave the operation a formal backdrop, a paper trail showing Iran was already out of compliance with international inspectors before a single bomb dropped. Israel moved first. Their campaign was called Operation Rising Lion, and it targeted Iranian nuclear facilities, along with the scientists and engineers running the program. Israel achieved air superiority over Iran fairly quickly and inflicted real serious damage on multiple above-ground facilities. But Israel ran into a hard physical wall. Israel does not own anything close to a 30,000-pound bunker buster. Their weapons simply could not punch through the depth of rock and reinforced concrete protecting one specific site, a site called Fordow. So Israel could hammer everything sitting on the surface, and it could set back facilities like Natanz and Isfahan in a real way. But Fordow just sat there, buried inside a mountain, essentially untouched by anything Israel could physically throw at it. That is the gap. That is the exact strategic gap that only the United States could close. And that is exactly why, days later, Operation Midnight Hammer happened. Not as some isolated American decision made independently, but as the missing piece of a campaign that only one country on this entire planet had the hardware to finish. So rewind with me to June 21st and June 22nd, 2025. The United States executes a mission called Operation Midnight Hammer. According to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, this was the largest operational strike in the entire history of the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber program. Let that sink in for a second, because that program has been flying since the 90s. 7 B-2s launch out of Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri. That is dead center of the country, and these jets fly a mission profile taking them on a full day round trip. More than 30 hours in the air total, all the way to Iran and back, refueling multiple times along the way from tanker aircraft in the dark. Here is something most coverage completely missed. This was not 7 bombers flying in a straight line to a target. There was a decoy package. A separate group of B-2s flew west, out over the Pacific, and that leaked into the news cycle early. For a few confusing hours, people actually thought that Western Group was the real strike package. It was not. That was deliberate misdirection, textbook operational security, and it worked perfectly. More than 125 aircraft total supported this mission when you count the bombers themselves, fighter escort, refueling tankers, and surveillance aircraft. The Pentagon never officially confirmed which fighters flew escort, but the public graphics they released strongly resembled stealth air superiority fighters, which makes total sense given the need to stay invisible over hostile airspace. And it was not just aircraft. At the same time, underwater, a U.S. Navy-guided missile submarine launched more than 24 cruise missiles at a separate target entirely. This was a coordinated multi-domain operation happening in the air and underwater at the same time. So here's the actual target list. 3 sites: Fordow, Natanz, Isfahan. These are the three pillars of Iran's uranium enrichment and processing infrastructure, and each one got hit completely differently based on what it actually was and how it was built. Let's start with Fordow, because this is the site that basically justified the existence of the weapon we are talking about today. Fordow's fuel enrichment plant sits buried somewhere between 80 and 90 meters underground, dug straight into a mountain near the city of Qom, roughly 160 kilometers south of Tehran. This site started life as something else entirely, reportedly a missile base, before it was converted into an enrichment facility. It was kept secret for years before Western intelligence discovered it, and it went public back in 2009. Fordow is deep, it is hardened, and it was purpose-built by engineers who studied exactly how Israel had taken out other nuclear facilities in the region in the past, and they buried this one deep enough that they believed conventional airstrikes could never touch it. That is not speculation, by the way. That is the consensus read from multiple defense analysis groups who have studied this site for over a decade. Israel does not operate anything like the weapon we are about to talk about. Nobody does, except the United States. According to the Pentagon's own briefing, at approximately 6:40 in the evening Eastern Time on June 21st, which was around 2 in the morning local time in Iran, the lead B-2 dropped the first 2 massive ordnance penetrators on Fordow. Over the next 25 minutes, the rest of the strike package released their weapons one after another. In total, 12 of these bunker busters were dropped on Fordow, and 2 more hit an underground portion of Natanz. That is 14 total bombs employed in this entire operation. And here is the detail that should genuinely blow your mind. This was the first time this weapon had ever been used in actual combat. 14 years in development, and this was its debut. Now let's actually talk about the bomb itself, because this thing is an engineering marvel, and I want you to understand why it exists and what it actually does, because the physics here are wild. The weapon is 30,000 pounds. Just sit with that number. That is 15 tons of bomb, and it can only be carried and dropped by the B-2 Spirit, because absolutely nothing else in the entire American arsenal has both the payload capacity and the stealth profile needed to deliver it. It was described plainly in the Pentagon briefing as steel, explosive, and a fuse. Sounds simple when you say it like that, but the engineering packed into that steel casing is what makes this weapon genuinely special. It is about 20 feet long, and it is specifically designed to punch through more than 100 feet of reinforced concrete before it even detonates. This bomb does not explode on impact. It is built to survive the impact, to tunnel down through solid rock and concrete using nothing but pure kinetic energy in a hardened penetrator casing, and then detonate at depth, exactly where the buried target sits, so the explosive force does maximum damage to whatever is hiding underground. Think about what that actually requires from an engineering standpoint. You have got a weapon experiencing massive, violent deceleration forces as it smashes through rock and concrete, and every single piece of that fusing and explosive train has to survive that punishment and still function perfectly at the very bottom. That is 15 years of engineering and testing that led up to this one moment. As a former Strike Eagle pilot, let me give you some real context on what it is actually like being the crew flying a mission like this. Even though this was a B-2 mission and not a fighter mission, when you are flying a strike package this deep into contested, hostile airspace, deception and stealth are absolutely everything. And by every account we have, the mission planning here worked flawlessly. Pentagon leadership stated that the United States is currently unaware of any shots fired at the strike package on the way in, and that Iran's own fighters never even took off. Iran's surface-to-air missile systems reportedly never even saw the package. The United States kept the element of surprise the entire way in and the entire way out. That is an enormous statement about how precisely this mission was planned and executed. Full stealth penetration of one of the most defended pieces of airspace in the entire Middle East on a 30-hour round trip, and not a single shot fired at the aircraft. Now let's talk about the other 2 targets, because they got hit in completely different ways and for completely different reasons. Natanz is Iran's largest and most historically significant enrichment complex, located roughly 250 kilometers south of Tehran. Natanz had both above-ground buildings and deeply buried underground enrichment halls. The above-ground structures had already taken damage from the earlier Israeli strikes, but the buried portions needed the bunker buster to reach them, which is exactly why 2 of the 14 bombs were allocated there. Isfahan is different again. Isfahan is a uranium conversion facility. This is the site where raw material gets converted into the gas feedstock you actually need before you can even put anything into centrifuges to enrich it. Isfahan's targets were mostly surface facilities, and instead of using the bunker busters here, the strike package used cruise missiles launched from that submarine, more than 24 of them fired after the bombing runs on the other 2 sites were already complete. Between the bunker busters and the cruise missiles, Pentagon officials said American forces employed roughly 75 precision-guided weapons total across this entire operation. Satellite imagery firms released before and after pictures in the days following the strike. At Fordow, that imagery showed multiple large craters and holes sitting directly over where the underground enrichment halls are believed to be, along with huge areas blanketed in dirt, ash, and debris blown out of ventilation shafts and access points. At Natanz, imagery showed a large crater consistent with 1 or 2 direct hits sitting right above the buried centrifuge halls, and the already damaged above-ground buildings showed even further destruction, with power infrastructure knocked out and never rebuilt. The initial public assessment from defense leadership was that every single precision weapon struck exactly where it was supposed to strike, with the intended effect. But here is the part of the story I think deserves the most attention, because this is genuinely where the real controversy lives, and this is the part most videos completely dropped after the first week. That was not the end of the story. There was a separate, far more cautious intelligence assessment that surfaced shortly after the strikes, reportedly from a preliminary defense intelligence review. That assessment reportedly found the underground structures at Fordow had not fully collapsed, and that Iran may have already moved a significant portion of its highly enriched uranium stockpile out of the site before the strikes ever happened. If that read was accurate, it would mean the raid set the program back by months rather than permanently destroying it. The public response to that leaked assessment was blunt, calling it flat out wrong. So right out of the gate, you've got 2 competing narratives. The public position that the sites were completely and totally destroyed, and a more cautious internal read suggesting partial success, with real uncertainty hanging over the fate of that enriched stockpile. I am not a nuclear engineer, and I am not an intelligence analyst, so I'm not going to sit here and tell you definitively which version is fully correct. What I can tell you, from reading through independent nuclear monitoring research over the following months, is that the truth appears to sit somewhere in that disputed middle, and it has actually evolved over the past year in a way that I think is way more interesting than either extreme take. Here is the part almost every other breakdown missed, because almost every other video on this topic was made in the days right after the strike and never got updated again. The story kept moving. Independent researchers, tracking this site by site with commercial satellite imagery, published a series of assessments over the following months. Several months out from the strike, the consensus read was that the June attacks likely destroyed or rendered inoperable almost all of Iran's roughly 22,000 installed centrifuges across its safeguarded enrichment sites. The strikes severely damaged Iran's ability to manufacture new centrifuges and to produce the feedstock gas the entire enrichment chain depends on. In plain terms, for the first time in about 20 years, researchers assessed that Iran had no clear identifiable path to producing weapons, grade uranium using its centrifuge program as it existed at that moment. That is a massive outcome if it holds. But here's the catch. The fate of Iran's existing stockpile of already enriched uranium remained, and still remains, the single biggest open question in this entire story. Before the strikes, Iran had accumulated roughly 400 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60%. That is well beyond anything needed for civilian nuclear power, and it sits right at the doorstep of weapons-grade material, which starts around 90%. Officials said publicly in the days after the strike that Iran likely still possessed that stockpile somewhere. Nobody could confirm exactly where. It could have been under the rubble at Fordow. It could have been moved to a tunnel complex near Isfahan. It could have been split across multiple locations, including a facility nicknamed Pickaxe Mountain near Natanz, a site that was under construction at the time and was never touched in that first wave of strikes. Then, things escalated again. Between February and April of 2026, there was a second round of conflict entirely. Additional strikes hit Iranian nuclear-adjacent sites, including a facility called Taligan 2, and more hits landed at Natanz. Reporting and satellite imagery suggested bunker busters were used again, this time on newly hardened targets, including a site that had been reinforced with a fresh concrete shell and buried under soil specifically in anticipation of another attack. Which tells you something important. Iran was actively preparing for round 2 the entire time everyone thought this story was already over. On February 28th of 2026, Iran terminated all international inspector access to its nuclear sites. Surveillance cameras were disabled, seals were removed from declared facilities. By every account, this is the most significant verification blackout inspectors have experienced with Iran since monitoring began. As of the most recent reporting available, Iran was holding approximately 440 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium. That is more material than before the original strikes, not less. And it is roughly enough, if further enriched to weapons grade, for about 10 nuclear devices. The agency's Director General has stated the material is likely held across the 3 main sites, but with inspectors barred entirely, none of this can currently be independently verified by anyone outside. So where does that leave the overall assessment right now, today? Based on the most recent open source damage estimates available, Natanz's main enrichment plant is assessed at around 75% damaged, with more than 6,000 first-generation centrifuges destroyed, and its research and development wing assessed at around 95% destroyed. Isfahan's conversion facility is assessed around 90% destroyed. And Fordow, the deep mountain bunker, the entire reason this bomb exists in the first place, is assessed by some open source analysts at only around 30% damaged, meaning the core facility may still be substantially intact, buried under enough rock and rubble that outside observers simply cannot get a clean read on it. That is a meaningfully different picture than completely and totally obliterated. And it is also a meaningfully different picture than nothing happened at all. It sits somewhere in between, and it is genuinely murky. And anyone who tells you they have total certainty on this a year later is overselling their own confidence. Anytime a mission like this happens, the internet fills up fast with theories, and I want to run through a few of the biggest ones circulating right now, because separating what is actually confirmed from what is just noise matters if you want to genuinely understand this operation, instead of just repeating whatever take you saw first. Theory 1. Some early chatter suggested Iran had advance warning and had already fully evacuated the enriched stockpile well before the strike, making the entire mission symbolic. What we actually know is more nuanced than that. Satellite imagery did show truck convoys near the tunnel entrances in the days before the strike. That imagery has been read two completely different ways by analysts. Either Iran was moving sensitive material and equipment out ahead of an anticipated attack, or just as plausibly, Iran was moving things into the site because they genuinely believed the mountain would protect everything inside it. Both readings exist in the open source record, and nobody has definitively settled which one is correct. So the version where they knew everything and cleared it all out completely is an oversimplification of a genuinely ambiguous piece of evidence. Theory 2. That the bombers faced significant air defense resistance, and it was quietly downplayed afterward. This one I can address directly from the Pentagon's own on-record briefing, and it points the other direction entirely. Leadership stated plainly that no shots were fired at the package on the way in or out, and that Iran's fighters never scrambled at all. If that were inaccurate, it would be an extraordinary thing for military leadership to misstate publicly on the record. So I personally do not put much weight behind this one. Theory 3, that this was a single, one-time strike, and the story basically ended in June of 2025. We already covered exactly why that is wrong. There was a second round of strikes between February and April of 2026. Additional hardened targets got hit, and the resulting inspector blackout is arguably a bigger ongoing story right now than the original strike itself. And Theory 4, which shows up constantly in comment sections everywhere. That obliterated and completely destroyed mean the exact same thing as Iran's nuclear ambitions being permanently over. Even in the most optimistic reading of these strikes, independent researchers are careful to separate destroying installed centrifuge infrastructure from eliminating a determined state's long-term intent and technical know-how. Iran retained its scientists. Iran retained its institutional knowledge. And by multiple accounts, Iran kept building at alternate sites, like that one near Natanz, the entire time. Physical infrastructure and strategic intent are two completely different things, and conflating them is exactly where a huge amount of the online debate goes sideways. Since this whole mission rides on one specific aircraft, let me give you a little more on the jet itself, because I think its backstory actually explains why it was the only platform on Earth that could have pulled this off. This bomber has been in service since the 1990s, developed originally as a Cold War-era answer to the need for something that could penetrate the densest air defense networks in the world without ever being detected. It is a flying wing design. No traditional fuselage, no vertical tail, which is unusual for an aircraft this large. That shape is central to how it defeats radar. Every seam, every intake, every weapons bay door is engineered to minimize how much of a return signal the jet bounces back to a ground station trying to detect it. Combine that shape with radar-absorbent skin coatings and fully internal weapons carriage, and you get an aircraft that can fly deep into contested airspace looking to enemy radar, like something far smaller than a multi-100,000-pound bomber. There have only ever been 21 of these aircraft built, and every single one of them flies out of that same base in Missouri. That is an incredibly small fleet for something this strategically important, and that tells you exactly how much national-level planning goes into deciding when and how these aircraft actually get committed to a real-world combat mission. Every single time you see one of these jets employed in anger rather than in a training exercise, that is a decision that went through the absolute highest levels of the chain of command, because you are risking a genuinely irreplaceable strategic asset. Now let's get back to what I actually know best, which is the flying, because I think this part of the story deserves way more attention than it usually gets. Flying a mission like this is nothing like flying a fighter jet. In a Strike Eagle, you are maneuvering constantly, you are reacting in real time, You have got a weapons officer in the back seat helping you manage the fight as it unfolds. A crew flying a mission like this, and it is only a two-person crew, pilot and mission commander, is managing an entirely different kind of workload. You are monitoring systems for over 30 straight hours. You're managing fatigue at a level most people never experience in their working life. You are doing multiple aerial refuelings in complete darkness, which is one of the single most demanding tasks in all of aviation, even under perfect conditions, because you are flying a precise formation position directly behind a tanker, while both aircraft are moving through the night on an extended high-stakes mission where there is genuinely zero room for even a small mistake. Based on everything reported about this mission, no shots fired at the package going in, no shots fired going out, enemy fighters never scrambling, enemy air defense radar apparently never even acquiring the formation. This was about as close to a textbook stealth penetration as you're ever going to see in real-world combat. That is not hype. That is what leadership described in their own official briefing, and it lines up exactly with what stealth doctrine is designed to achieve in the first place. I also want to point out the sheer psychological weight of flying a mission like this. Going in that if something goes wrong, a mechanical failure, a fuel problem, an unexpected engagement, you are sitting deep inside hostile territory with very few good options left. That 30-hour round trip is mentally demanding in a way that is genuinely hard to describe, unless you have personally sat in that seat for a long-duration combat sortie. Every single one of those crew members earned every bit of credit they have received for this mission. I think it is worth zooming out for a second on why this weapon was developed in the first place, because it actually tells you something about how deterrence works at the highest level. For years, this specific buried facility was considered functionally invulnerable to conventional airstrikes, purely because of how deep it sat underground. That created a genuine strategic problem. If a facility is completely invulnerable to strike, it removes a major deterrent against a country continuing to expand it indefinitely. So defense planners invested roughly 15 years developing a weapon specifically capable of defeating exactly that kind of target. That is the kind of long-horizon investment that never gets headlines until the one single day it actually gets used, and that day was June 22nd, 2025. It is also worth saying that using a weapon this powerful, at this scale, against a nuclear-related target inherently carries real risk, which is exactly why an operation like this only happens after military leadership, intelligence assessments, and civilian oversight all sign off together. This is not a decision made lightly, and it is not one I'm going to armchair quarterback from a studio. What I can do is walk you through the engineering and the operational execution, because that part is verifiable, and honestly, it is genuinely remarkable from a pure aviation and weapons engineering standpoint. It is also worth touching on how this landed politically, since that shaped a huge amount of the coverage at the time. Domestically, this operation triggered intense debate over war powers, and whether deeper consultation should have happened first. Internationally, reactions split largely along existing alliance lines. Allies, who had already backed the earlier Israeli campaign, framed the American strike as a necessary final piece needed to prevent a hardened, dangerous enrichment site from surviving the broader effort. Meanwhile, other governments and international bodies raised concerns about the precedent of striking nuclear-related infrastructure directly, and about the safety of bombing sites that store enriched material. The International Monitoring Agency itself has stayed fairly restrained in its public statements, sticking mostly to what it can actually verify, rather than weighing in on the strategic wisdom of the strikes, which really just reflects the agency's actual mandate. It is a monitoring body, not a policy body, and its statements since then have focused almost entirely on the verification blackout, rather than any judgment on the operation itself. I bring this up because it is easy to watch a breakdown like this one and only walk away thinking about the hardware and the mission execution side of the story. But this operation sits inside a much bigger, still completely unresolved diplomatic picture. And that context matters if you are actually trying to understand why coverage of this kept evolving for over a year instead of wrapping up in the days right after the strike. So here is my honest breakdown as somebody who has personally flown combat missions, though obviously never anything at this scale or with this kind of strategic weight behind it. From a pure execution standpoint, this mission is about as clean as a strike package gets. Deep penetration, complete stealth, 0 shots fired at the formation, precision weapons released on multiple hardened targets, and a safe return of every single aircraft and crew member involved. Whatever your personal view on the strategic decision to launch this operation in the first place, the execution by the air crews, the tanker crews, the mission planners, and everyone supporting this from the ground was genuinely outstanding. Where I think people need to slow down is on the mission accomplished framing that dominated the news cycle in the first 48 hours. Based on everything that has come out since then, the initial cautious intelligence assessment, the ongoing dispute over the actual structural condition of that deep bunker, the unresolved location of hundreds of kilograms of enriched uranium, the second round of strikes less than a year later, and the decision to cut off all outside verification entirely, I think the responsible read is that this set the program back significantly, probably by years, in terms of centrifuge manufacturing and enrichment infrastructure. But it did not eliminate the underlying problem, and it did not eliminate the underlying stockpile. That is not a knock on the pilots or the mission planning at all. That is just what happens when you try to use airstrikes to solve something that is, at its core, a materials and verification problem. You can absolutely destroy centrifuges with a big enough bomb. It is a lot harder to guarantee you have destroyed or even located hundreds of kilograms of enriched material that a determined country has had months to move and hide. I also want to flag this clearly because it matters for how you read any future coverage on this topic. This is a story that is still actively developing right now as we speak. Verification reporting from the outside is incomplete by the monitoring agency's own admission. Independent satellite imagery analysts are still publishing brand new assessments every few months as fresh imagery comes in. If you ever see anyone presenting this as a fully closed chapter, be skeptical of that immediately. Because the people actually doing the real on the ground, technical assessment, are still saying, right now, as of the most recent reporting, that they cannot verify exactly where that enriched stockpile actually sits. So that is the full breakdown. Operation Midnight Hammer, the bunker buster bomb, 14 years in the making, 7 stealth bombers, a 30-hour round trip from Missouri to Iran and back, 14 bunker busters and dozens of cruise missiles, 3 nuclear sites hit in under half an hour of actual weapons release, and a strategic outcome that is still being written today, more than a year later. This is one of the most consequential, and honestly, one of the most technically remarkable air operations of the last several decades. And I wanted to give you guys the real complete picture. Not just the headline everyone already saw, but the follow-up reporting that most channels never bother going back to cover. Before you go, I have got 2 things I want from you. First, if this kind of deep dive, source military breakdown is exactly what you come to this channel for, hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because I am going to keep tracking this story as new imagery and new reporting comes out, and I genuinely do not want you missing the update when there is real news to report. Second, drop a comment below and tell me exactly what part of this operation you want me to break down next. The stealth bomber's radar defeating design, aerial refueling procedures on a mission like this one, how stealth strike planning actually works from the mission commander's seat. I read every single comment, and honestly, a huge chunk of my future videos come straight from what you guys ask me to cover. This is Ryan, also known as Max Afterburner, also known as the fighter pilot next door, signing off. Fly safe, everybody.